Welcome to Poetry with Shing, where we uncover the beauty behind poetry. In this episode, we'll be looking at yet another quote in Howard's End by E.M. Forster. This time, the quote is All men are equal, all men, that is, who possess umbrellas. This quote can be found in chapter 6 of Howard's End, and our question for today is to consider how this quote is reflective of the novel. When approaching this question, I would urge everybody to think about first whether or not E.M. Forster, the author, rejects or accepts this quote. For one, quotes can always appear wherever in a literature text, and you got to ask yourself whether or not the author is agreeing with the quote or is the author trying to show that he or she disagrees with this notion, and how does this author portray his or her opinions towards the quote that is presented in the novel. So, in this case, our question would be asking us whether or not the quote is reflective of the novel. So you've got to ask yourself, since the question stem is how, you've got to ask yourself, is it reflective? Does Forster reject or accept the idea that all men who carry umbrellas are equal? And before you even ask yourself whether Forster rejects or Forster accepts, I think it's also important to think about what this quote reflects. So, what does umbrella signify? What's the symbolism of the umbrella? And what is the meaning of the quote in relation to the novel? You also have to think about different evidence in the book and how you can use it to support your stance about whether Forster rejects or accepts the quote that is presented in our essay question. Finally, you can also link back to Forster's intentions of writing the novel. So whether or not Forster accepts or Forster rejects this quote will also be linked to his intentions of writing the novel. So if you're very clear about what his intentions are, to talk about, say, the importance of connection, because only connect is the epigraph of the novel, then you'll be able to link Forster's intentions to whether he accepts or rejects this quote, and whether this quote is in line with the idea of only connect. Alright, so before we begin, I'll be outlining how we could possibly approach this question and how we could possibly argue whether or not this quote is reflective of the novel. So firstly, the idea of equality is something that we need to break down before we actually write our body paragraphs. So we need to define our key terms in the introduction paragraph. So the idea of equal could be linked to the theme of social status and class, which you know that is very important in the novel, with the Wilcoxes and the Schlegels being juxtaposed against Leonard Bast, who comes from the lower classes. And when there is the idea of social status, you can also link social status to class differences. And also, what are the tensions that are underlying class differences? There will be things like ideals and materialism. Ideals being that represented by the Schlegels and materialism being that represented by the Wilcoxes. So even within the upper classes, there's already some tension that you can dissect. And you can also consider those tensions between the classes, which I mentioned just now, between Schlegels, Wilcoxes, and the Basts. So beyond that, we also have to dissect what the symbol of umbrella means. So in this case, I would define umbrellas as a symbol of gentility, which is emblematic of those from the upper classes. And it could also signify a form of protection from the weather. And this weather could be metaphorical, like for example, when you are going through hard times. So how does the umbrella make people put people at put people at an put people at an advantage compared to those without umbrellas? So that's something that you can also explore in your essay. So I would hazard a guess that the quote puts forth the notion that without gentility and a means to protect oneself, equality in social status and readiness for the future of England cannot come to fruition. So does Foster accept or reject this notion that the ownership of umbrellas set the upper classes apart from the rest of the classes? We will find out in our essay. So next, after defining and breaking down the quote, I'll be going through how I might structure my essay. So I would split my essay into 3 body paragraphs. So I had my introduction, which will be summarizing the way I dissect the quote, including defining key terms. And then for my first body paragraph, I would address the idea of Foster denouncing treating arts as capital. So how does this link to the umbrellas? This links to the umbrellas because the symbol of equality and the idea of class differences also points to the fact that people from the lower classes might not be able to pursue their artistic passions, or even treat arts as some sort of capital or something that elevates their social standing. So Foster denounces the ability of arts in alleviating the social standing of people from the lower classes. And the evidence that I will cite would be Bast's method of death. Thereafter, I will go on to talk about how I'll go on to actually fully examine how Bast died, which would be where he was crushed by the bookcase, but that wasn't actually the cause of his death. It was the heart attack that caused his death. And I would break down why exactly this heart attack is actually significant compared in addition to the bookcase being crushed on him. And I will also address the idea of how the Schlegels think that arts could be capital, but they are from the upper classes. And how do we reconcile these two groups of people who equally think that arts is an important capital to have? Secondly, I will also talk about how the quote reflects deeply entrenched class systems in England, which Foster once again denounces, which I have explained earlier on in the quote, and how the idea of equality only residing amongst the upper classes is something that Foster does not agree with. And the evidence that I will cite would be Henry's bequeathing of Howard's End to Margaret, subsequently even the classless child. And finally, I will also link the idea of the bequeathing of Howard's End to the classless child indirectly to how these class systems essentially dissolve and the quote does not really stand. Finally, in my third body paragraph, I would be addressing how Foster concedes of the need for protection in the face of a rapidly transforming England. So the idea of protection links back to the quote with their symbolism of the umbrella, and that would be my essay outline. So without further ado, I would be sharing with you how I might structure my essay, and you can slow down the video if you think that I'm reading my essay out too fast. Alright, let's begin. In chapter 6 of Howard's End, Leonard Bast's umbrella is stolen shortly before he says, "All men are equal, all men, that is, who possess umbrellas." The quote hints at themes underlying Howard's End, including class differences, the tensions between ideals and materialism, and the cosmopolitanism and modernization that England experiences. In the quote, equal connotes equality both in social status and in respectability and preparedness for the future of England. Umbrellas is a symbol of gentility, emblematic of those of the upper classes, and is also an imagery of a tool used to shield one from the elements. Hence, the quote put forth the notion that without gentility and a means to protect oneself, equality in social status and readiness for the future of England cannot come into fruition. Forster rejects this notion that the ownership of umbrellas sets some apart from the rest, and instead proposes the dissolving of the class system in England to only connect, and the reconciling of material and ideals as capital, to see things steadily and see them whole, with balance in both respects. Forster does this by using plot sequencing, symbolism, and foreshadowing. Yet, despite Forster's rejection of this notion, he does concede that ultimately a degree of wealth or protection is fundamental to keeping up with the changing times in the face of a modernizing England. So that was my introduction. Now we'll be moving on to the first body paragraph. Firstly, this quote reflects Forster's denouncing of treating arts as capital, through the use of symbolism in Bast's death by being crushed by a bookcase and having a heart attack. The quote symbol of umbrellas signal gentility that is represented by the pursuit of ideals and the art as capital. But since Forster frowns upon the quote, it shows Forster does not support this view. Forster's rejection of this notion is further supported by the symbolic connotation of Bast's tragedy in his pursuit of arts as capital. Early on in the novel, Bast shares with the Schlegel sisters about his late-night stroll in nature. He admitted he did not feel a thing after the stroll, and the Schlegel sisters replied that, what's the use of having all this when you cannot apply it to your daily life? His nonchalance at feeling nothing special in spite of the Schlegels' admiration of his contact with romanticism and ideals through the night stroll reveals his inability to connect heart-to-heart with the arts. When the Schlegels criticize him of not applying his knowledge of the arts to his life, it signals Bast's fundamental treatment of the arts not as an enjoyment, but as a means to rise up the social ladder. Forster condemns this one-sided treatment of the arts and regards it as futile. This is shown in Bast's eventual demise, where he grabs onto a bookcase to stable himself, but ends up being crushed by it, trapping him under it. The symbol of a bookcase connotes the ideals and knowledge Bast had so diligently tried to acquire and so firmly believed would save him from the abyss. Yet, it is this very bookcase that causes his death, signaling Forster's rejection of using arts as capital, as it will backfire and prove to be more harmful than beneficial, as in Bast's case. This idea is further solidified by Bast dying of a heart attack after being crushed by the bookcase. The heart attack caused by the failure of the heart is symbolic of Bast's ultimate inability to see the arts for its true value, and it strengthens Forster's condemnation of using arts as capital. Instead, Forster proposes enjoying the arts for its worth, just as the Schlegels do, in order to see life steadily and see it whole. Unlike Bast, who narrowly fixates on one aspect of the arts, the Schlegels acknowledge the power of the arts as capital by saying how the arts can civilize people, but also appreciate the nature of the arts, as shown in their frequent visits to concerts, including Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Hence, Forster suggests seeing the arts as a whole, not only as capital, but also appreciating its intangible worth. Thus, in view of the umbrella signifying gentility as capital, Forster rejects the quote. Now moving on to our second body paragraph. Secondly, this quote reveals the deeply entrenched class system in England that Forster denounces through the use of plot sequencing in Henry Wilcox's bequeathing of Howard's End to Margaret Schlegel. Instead, Forster calls for an England where all men connect without bitterness, and urges for a classless England where class divisions do not exist. The quote is reflective of the mainstream British perception that umbrellas are a social status marker that distinguishes someone from the lower classes from someone in the upper classes. Hence, it suggests that all men are equal only if they are from the upper classes, evidence of this rigid class structure in the novel. Foster rejects this through proposing a classless England. Towards the end of the novel, in Henry's bequeathing of Howard's End to Margaret, the class lines are blurred, highlighting Foster's belief of the need for connection between classes in England's future. After keeping Howard's End for many years despite Ruth's bequeathing of it before her death to Margaret, Henry decides to give Howard's End to Margaret. Additionally, as the house would be ultimately given to the classless child born out of wedlock between Helen and Leonard, Foster uses this deliberate plot device to indicate to readers how he wishes for a classless England, where people are equal regardless of class. Hence, in relation to the quote, which implies people are equal only if they are from the upper classes, Foster uses the bequeathing of Howard's End to refute this. Finally, this quote reflects Foster's concessions of the need for protection in the face of a rapidly transforming England through the use of foreshadowing. Although Foster disagrees that art should solely be viewed as capital, and only people of the upper classes are equal, Foster concedes that a means of protection is vital in 20th century cosmopolitan England. The quote, with the umbrella symbolizing shelter from the elements, agrees with Foster's view that in order to keep up with modernization, one needs to have protection in order to allow England to have transitoriness and eternal youth. Foster employs foreshadowing in how Bass has his umbrella stolen by Helen during the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony concert. This foreshadows Bass' lack of shelter in the face of changing times that will lead to his demise, and is proven to be true as Bass loses his job at a new investment company after leaving Porphyrion on Helen's advice. Symbolic for him leaving his shelter at Porphyrion, the sheer speed at which he loses his job is reflective of the fast-paced motion of 20th century England that Bass cannot keep up with, indicated by Foster through Bass's retrenchment. Hence, through this foreshadowing, Foster portrays the importance of shelter in ensuring one can type with the cosmopolitan, changing times of England. As such, Foster urges readers to embrace England's transitoriness, signaled by its rapid demodernization, and eternal youth by seeking refuge in England's past values that will allow one to stay relevant in a changing England. Thus, the quote, reflective of the need for shelter amid changing times, is reflective of Foster's intentions. Now, to conclude, the quote is reflective of Foster's intentions in denouncing art as solely capital and encouraging the creation of a classless England, as Foster largely disagrees with the quote. However, Foster does concede that shelter is crucial in a changing England, conceding partially with the quote. In doing so, Foster employs symbolism, foreshadowing, and plot sequencing to encourage connection between classes and appreciating the arts both for its tangible and intangible value. Alright, that marks the end of our discussion of today's essay question. Hope that you enjoyed it. And if you would like to hear me dissect any other poems, poems or any other quotes from literature texts, do feel free to leave them in the comments below. Hope that you enjoyed our episode today. Thank you and goodbye.